The clatter of a silver fork against porcelain was the only sound that dared to move. Then, Beatrice Croft's voice, sharp as shattered crystal, sliced through the hushed reverence of L'Étoile d'Or. Take it back. Now. Every head in the Michelin-starred dining room, a sanctuary of hushed tones and astronomical prices, turned. Waitstaff froze mid-pour. Diners paused, their meticulously crafted bites of seared scallops hovering halfway to their lips. The air, once fragrant with truffle and ambition, was now thick with the metallic tang of public humiliation. Maya, 21 years old, her face still holding the soft uncertainty of youth, stood beside the table. Her uniform was impeccably starched, a stark white against her warm brown skin, but her hands, clasped behind her back, trembled slightly. She was a culinary student, working double shifts here to afford tuition and send money home to her grandmother in Georgia. This job was more than a paycheck. It was a foothold in a world she dreamed of mastering. "Mom?" Maya's voice was a whisper, a small bird against a hurricane. "Are you deaf as well as incompetent?" Beatrice Croft, a woman in her late 40s whose face was a taut masterpiece of surgical precision, pointed a diamond-encrusted finger at a faint, almost invisible smudge on the sleeve of her cream-colored silk blouse. "This is a vintage Chanel. You and your clumsy, careless hands just cost me more than you'll make in a year. You spilled wine on me." Maya's mind raced. She hadn't. She was certain. Her movements were practiced, economical, born of 1,000 hours of balancing trays and navigating crowded spaces. She had placed the breadbasket down, her hands nowhere near Mrs. Croft's wine glass. But certainty was a currency she couldn't spend here. Sterling Croft, Beatrice's husband, a man whose soft physique and indolent posture spoke of a life lived on the coattails of inherited wealth, smirked into his napkin. "Honestly, Beatrice, what can you expect? They hire them right off the street these days." He waved a dismissive hand in Maya's direction. "No grace, no training." The words were meant to be a private aside, but in the suffocating silence, they carried across the room. A few diners shifted uncomfortably, their gazes dropping to their plates. Others watched with a detached, hungry curiosity, as if this were part of the evening's entertainment. From a small, secluded table in the corner, Eleanor Vance watched. At 72, she was a woman who had learned the art of invisibility. Dressed in a simple, well-made but unassuming charcoal grey dress, with her silver hair pulled back in a simple bun, she could have been anyone's grandmother. She held a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with a lifetime of observations written in a precise, elegant script. She had come to L'Étoile d'Or tonight for a reason that had nothing to do with its 3 Michelin stars. It was the anniversary of her husband, Arthur's, passing, and this had been his favorite place for celebrating life's small victories. She had come to sit with his memory, to order his favorite wine, and to feel close to him in a room he had loved. But the ugly scene, unfolding near the center of the room, was a desecration of that memory. She watched Maya's posture, the way her shoulders tensed but did not slump, the way her chin remained level, even as color flooded her cheeks. She saw the girl's eyes dart to the wine glass, then to the table, her mind clearly replaying the moment, searching for the error she knew she hadn't made. Eleanor had seen that look before, the look of someone forced to question their own reality in the face of another's power. The restaurant manager, a tall, impeccably dressed man named Jean-Pierre Dubois, glided toward the table. His face was a mask of professional concern, honed by years of placating the fragile egos of the city's elite. "Mr. and Mrs. Croft, is there a problem?" His voice was smooth as velvet. "A problem?" Beatrice scoffed, her voice rising. "Your waitress has ruined my blouse. She's careless. I want her fired." Dubois' eyes flickered toward Maya, a brief, unreadable expression crossing his features before the mask of neutrality snapped back into place. He was a man caught in the crossfire. The Crofts were regulars, their spending habits legendary. Maya was a good employee, diligent and quiet. But in the brutal calculus of high-end hospitality, the customer was not just right. They were sovereign. "I am terribly sorry, Mrs. Croft," Dubois said, his voice a low murmur of apology. "Of course, the restaurant will cover any and all cleaning costs. As for the staff member..." He paused, his gaze resting on Maya. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel the weight of every stare in the room. To be fired from L'Étoile d'Or would be a black mark on her record, a stain harder to remove than any wine. "I didn't spill it," she said, her voice barely audible but firm. "I know I didn't." Beatrice let out a laugh that was more of a bark. "Oh, it's a liar, too. Perfect. Get her out of my sight, Jean-Pierre, before I lose my appetite entirely." Dubois gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Maya, perhaps you should take a break in the back." It was a dismissal couched in kindness, a firing deferred. As Maya turned to leave, her eyes, filled with a mixture of shame and defiance, swept the room. They briefly met Eleanor's. Eleanor offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of the injustice. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. Maya walked away, her back straight, her dignity a fragile shield against the whispers that followed her. The storm had passed, but the air remained poisoned. Beatrice Croft, triumphant, settled back into her seat. Dubois offered complimentary champagne. The performance of luxury resumed. But Eleanor Vance had seen everything. She saw the lie. She saw the cruelty. And she saw something else. Something small that everyone else had missed. On the pristine white tablecloth, just inches from Sterling Croft's elbow, was a single, tiny, dark red droplet of wine. It was on the wrong side of the table. It was a detail that didn't fit the story, and Eleanor Vance had built a legendary career on details that didn't fit. She picked up her pen, opened her notebook to a fresh page, and began to write. If you have ever been falsely accused, made to feel small, or watched as power was used to crush the powerless, then what happens next in this temple of gastronomy will make you hold your breath. For in a world that judges by the label on the clothes and the name on the reservation, a quiet observer is about to remind everyone that true value is not something you can buy. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor behind the kitchen, Maya leaned against a cool metal wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The cacophony of the kitchen, the clang of pans, the shouts of chefs, was a world away from the weaponized silence of the dining room. Humiliation burned hot behind her eyes, but she refused to let the tears fall. Crying felt like a concession, an admission of the weakness they saw in her. She replayed the moment 100 times, the placement of the bread, the turn of her body, the distance from the table. There was no spill. It was a fabrication, a casual act of cruelty from a woman who treated service staff as props in the theatre of her own importance. She knew it, but knowing and proving were two different countries, and she had no passport to the latter. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from her grandmother. "Just checking in, sweet pea. Hope you're having a good night. Love you." Maya's throat tightened. Her grandmother, who had raised her, who believed in her with an unwavering faith, would be heartbroken to see her like this. She was working this hard for her, for them. The thought solidified her resolve. She would not be broken by this. Back in the dining room, Jean-Pierre Dubois was performing a masterclass in damage control. He personally decanted a new bottle of wine for the Crofts, a 1982 Chateau Margaux, a bottle that cost more than Maya's monthly rent. His movements were fluid, his apologies effusive. 1,000 apologies for the disruption, Mrs. Croft, he murmured. Beatrice waved a languid hand, basking in the attention. It's fine, Jean-Pierre, as long as the girl is dealt with. Standards, you know. They're all that separate a place like this from a common diner. Sterling Croft swirled the deep crimson liquid in his glass, holding it up to the light. Excellent. A proper vintage. None of that New World nonsense. He took a sip, his eyes closing in a parody of connoisseurship. Perfection. From her corner table, Eleanor watched them. She had seen men like Sterling Croft her entire life, men who used the language of sophistication to mask a profound lack of substance. She noted the way he held the glass, the way he drank rather than tasted. He was playing a part. Her own order arrived, a simple plate of roasted root vegetables and a glass of Sancerre. The young sommelier, a man named Antoine, who was genuinely passionate about his craft, had been surprised by her choice. An excellent, if humble selection, madame, he had said, intrigued. My husband believed you could judge a kitchen, not by its lobster, but by its carrots, Eleanor had replied with a soft smile, and a cellar not by its grand crus, but by the quality of its simplest white. Now, as she ate, her senses were on high alert. She was not just a diner, she was an analyst. She observed the flow of the room, the timing of the service, the subtle interactions between staff. Dubois, for all his polish, seemed distracted. His eyes kept darting towards the kitchen, then back to the Crofts' table. He was worried. A scene like that, even when managed, left a scar on the evening's atmosphere. Eleanor's gaze drifted back to the Crofts' table. Sterling was holding forth now, telling some loud, self-aggrandizing story to his wife. As he gestured emphatically, his sleeve brushed against his wine glass. A few drops sloshed over the rim, landing on the white tablecloth. He didn't notice. Beatrice, engrossed in her own reflection in the back of a silver spoon, didn't notice. But Eleanor noticed, and she saw it was the exact same type of small, dark red stain she had seen earlier, near his own place setting. The pieces began to click into place. Sterling, clumsy and arrogant, had likely spilled the first drop himself, too proud to admit his own mistake, and with Beatrice primed for confrontation, they had found a convenient scapegoat in the young, unassuming waitress. It was a simple, ugly, and utterly believable explanation. A new waiter, a nervous young man named Leo, was assigned to the Crofts' table. He approached with the caution of a soldier entering a minefield. "Will there be anything else, sir?" he asked Sterling. Sterling looked him up and down. "Just try not to spill anything, son. We've already had one disaster tonight." The barb, tossed out so casually, landed with precision. Leo flushed and retreated. The Crofts were poisoning the well for everyone. It was then that Maya re-emerged from the kitchen. She wasn't carrying a tray. She walked directly to Dubois, who was standing near the Maître d'Hôtel's station. She spoke to him in a low, urgent voice. Eleanor couldn't hear the words, but she could see the intensity in Maya's expression, the subtle shake of her head, the way her hands gestured towards the Crofts' table. Dubois listened, his face impassive at first, then a flicker of something. Annoyance? Skepticism? Crossed his features. He shook his head dismissively and said something that made Maya's shoulders slump. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen, her brief flare of courage extinguished. Eleanor felt a pang of something sharp and unfamiliar. It was anger. Not the hot, explosive kind, but a cold, clear, clarifying anger. Arthur had always said she had a formidable sense of justice. "You're like a hawk, Ellie," he'd say. "You see everything from a distance, and you don't miss a thing." She looked down at her notebook. It contained her observations, her analysis of the restaurant's performance. It was a private ledger of her experience. But tonight, it felt insufficient. A quiet record of a crime does not stop it from happening. She caught Antoine's eye and beckoned him over. "Is everything to your liking, madame?" he asked. "The Sancerre is lovely, thank you, Antoine," she said, her voice calm and measured. "But I find myself curious about something. The Chateau Margaux you are serving the Crofts. The 82, a magnificent year. Difficult to source." Antoine's face lit up, pleased by her knowledge. "Indeed, madame, we were very fortunate to acquire a case. It is the pride of our cellar." "May I see the bottle?" Eleanor asked. The request was unusual, but not unheard of. Antoine hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Of course, madame." He retrieved the bottle from the Crofts' table, presenting it to Eleanor with a flourish. She didn't touch it. She simply looked. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, scanned the label, the paper stock, the font, the slight discoloration of the glue. She had seen hundreds of bottles from that vintage over the years, held them in her own cellar. She knew their history, their feel, their story. "Thank you, Antoine," she said, her voice soft. "That's all I needed." He returned the bottle to the table, puzzled. Eleanor picked up her pen. She circled a single word she had written in her notebook. Wrong. The wine stain was a lie. The waitress was innocent. But the real deception, she now suspected, was far deeper. It was sitting right there on the table, in a bottle worth $5,000, and no one else in the room had a clue. And the young waitress who had been so cruelly dismissed might just be the only other person who had sensed it. The system was failing. The manager was protecting the money. The powerful were protecting their pride. And an innocent girl was about to lose her job and her foothold on her dream. Eleanor Vance closed her notebook. The time for quiet observation was over. The main course had been served. The Crofts were eating their Chateaubriand with a possessive air, as if they had conquered it personally. Beatrice, having secured her victory, was now holding court, her voice a constant, grating presence in the otherwise serene atmosphere. She was recounting the story of the spill to a neighboring table, embellishing it with each telling, painting Maya as a clumsy oaf who had practically assaulted her with the wine bottle. "You just can't find good help anymore," she concluded with a dramatic sigh, loud enough for half the room to hear. In the kitchen, Dubois cornered Maya by the dish station. "What was that out there?" he demanded, his voice low and tense. "I told you to stay in the back." "Mr. Dubois, I had to tell you," Maya insisted, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and conviction. "I was watching them from the service door. When Antoine poured their wine, something is not right with it." Dubois stared at her, incredulous. "What are you talking about?" "The color," Maya whispered, leaning closer. "An 82 Margaux should have more bricking, more amber tones at the rim. That wine is too purple, too vibrant. And the sediment, when he decanted it, there wasn't enough. For a wine that old... It's wrong. I'm studying enology in my course, sir. I've read all the books. I've seen the photos. It's... Enough." Dubois cut her off, his patience gone. "You are a waitress, Maya, not a sommelier. You were just publicly accused of incompetence, and now you are questioning a $5,000 bottle of wine. Do you see how this looks? It looks like a desperate, petty act of revenge. Drop it. Go home for the night. I will call you tomorrow to discuss your future here." The finality in his tone was like a door slamming shut. Her future. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. She had tried to do the right thing, to use her knowledge, and had been shut down completely. Defeated, she nodded, untied her apron, and walked toward the staff exit, the weight of a false accusation and a dismissed truth pressing down on her. It was Beatrice who delivered the final, cruel blow. As Maya passed through a corner of the dining room to retrieve her coat, Beatrice saw her. A malicious smile spread across her face. "Oh, look, Sterling. The help is finally being taken out with the trash." The comment was a physical blow. Maya flinched, her eyes burning. She kept walking, focusing on the exit, on escape. "Not so fast," Beatrice called out, her voice ringing with authority. She stood up, blocking Maya's path. "You never apologized." Maya stopped, trapped. I have nothing to apologize for." "Wrong answer," Beatrice said, her smile tightening. "You ruined my blouse. You lied about it, and you embarrassed me. I think a proper apology is the least you can do, on your knees." A collective gasp went through the room. This was no longer a simple complaint. It was a public execution. Sterling Croft chuckled. Dubois, standing a few feet away, looked horrified, but he was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the demand. "I said," Beatrice repeated, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "On your knees. Apologize, and maybe I won't call the owner and tell him what a pathetic staff you're running here, Jean-Pierre." All eyes were on Maya. She stood alone in the center of a silent, staring circle. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. Her mind was screaming, "Don't do it, don't you dare do it." But her body felt heavy, her will dissolving under the immense pressure. Losing this job was one thing. Being blacklisted, unable to pay her tuition, letting her grandmother down. The fear was a physical thing, pushing her down. Her knees began to buckle. "That will be quite enough." The voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension with the authority of a judge's gavel. It came from the corner table. Eleanor Vance was on her feet. She had placed her napkin neatly on the table and was looking directly at Beatrice Croft. Her expression was not angry. It was something far more unnerving. It was profoundly disappointed, as if she were addressing a child who had failed a simple moral test. Beatrice whirled around. "And who do you think you are?" "I am a diner who wishes to finish her meal in peace," Eleanor said calmly, taking a step forward. "And I am a witness to a lie." She turned her gaze to Sterling Croft. "Sir, you are the one who spilled the wine. A single drop when you first sat down. I saw it from my table. And you," she said, her eyes now resting on Beatrice, "chose to turn that tiny accident into a weapon to humiliate a young woman who was only doing her job." Sterling sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. That's an outrageous accusation." "Is it?" Eleanor's voice remained even. "Perhaps. But it's not the most outrageous thing happening at this table tonight." She looked at Dubois, who was now staring at her, a dawning sense of dread on his face. "Mr. Dubois, you pride yourself on the standards of this establishment, do you not?" "Of course, madam," he stammered. "Then you should be aware that you are serving your customers counterfeit wine." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence of shock, of disbelief. The accusation was an atomic bomb dropped into the heart of the restaurant. Dubois found his voice first. "Madame, that is a very serious claim. I can assure you, our cellar is impeccable." "Is it?" Eleanor walked calmly towards the Crofts' table. She didn't look at them. She looked at the bottle of Chateau Margaux. An 82 Margaux is a legend. It is also one of the most counterfeited wines in the world. A real one has a label printed on a specific, slightly porous paper stock. "This one," she said, pointing but not touching, is too glossy. The kerning on the word chateau is incorrect by less than a millimetre, but it's incorrect. The ullage, the space between the cork and the wine, is too small for a wine of this age. It suggests a more recent bottling. Antoine, the sommelier, had moved closer, his face pale, listening intently. He knew she was right. These were the details only a true expert would know. Eleanor continued, her voice clear and didactic, as if delivering a lecture. But the most damning evidence, as your very observant waitress tried to tell you, is in the glass. She turned to Maya, who was standing, forgotten for a moment, her eyes wide with astonishment. You were right, my dear. The colour is wrong. It lacks the telltale brick-red edge of aged Cabernet. It's too robust, too youthful. It's likely a good Bordeaux, perhaps a Saint-Estèphe from a more recent vintage, but it is not a 1982 Chateau Margaux. It is a very expensive fraud. Every eye was now on the bottle, this symbol of wealth and status, now revealed as a cheap impostor. The Crofts looked as if they had been slapped. Their performance of sophistication had been publicly and expertly dismantled. Dubois stared at Eleanor, a wave of cold realization washing over him. He had seen her face before, in trade magazines, at award ceremonies, older now, but the eyes, the sharp, intelligent eyes were the same. You, he whispered, his voice cracking. You are Evie Winter. The name fell into the room, and the atmosphere changed instantly. Evie Winter wasn't just a critic. She was the critic. Her anonymous column, The Winter Palate, was the most respected and feared voice in the culinary world for 40 years. But she was more than that. She was a silent partner, an investor in a dozen of the country's most acclaimed restaurants. Her reputation was built on an almost mythical integrity and an unerring eye for detail. Her word didn't just influence opinions, it shaped fortunes. Beatrice Croft's jaw went slack. Evie Winter, she stammered. But you're supposed to be. She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Rich? Glamorous? Not this quiet, plainly dressed old woman. Eleanor ignored her. Her focus was on Dubois. Your supplier has been cheating you, Jean-Pierre, and your pride, your eagerness to placate a wealthy bully almost cost you the one employee who had the knowledge and the integrity to notice. She then turned her calm, unwavering gaze to Maya. You have an exceptional palate and a keen eye, young lady. That is a rare gift. Never let anyone make you doubt it. Maya stood, speechless, as the woman she had only read about in textbooks, a living legend, defended her. The humiliation and fear washed away, replaced by a profound, trembling sense of validation. The power in the room had not just shifted, it had been completely rewritten. The Crofts, who had entered like royalty, now looked small and fraudulent. Dubois, the arbiter of elegance, was exposed as a man who had nearly sacrificed integrity for profit. And Maya, the invisible waitress, was now at the center of it all, vindicated by the most powerful voice in the room. The performance was over. The truth had just been served. The aftermath was not an explosion, but a quiet, methodical implosion. Sterling Croft was the first to break, pushing his chair back with a scrape that sounded like a scream in the silent room. This is absurd. We're leaving. He threw his napkin on the table, a gesture of defiance that now looked pathetic. You will be staying, Eleanor said, her voice soft but leaving no room for argument. Mr. Dubois has a matter of fraud to discuss with you. After all, you vouched for the wine's perfection. One has to wonder if you were a victim of the fraud or a participant. The insinuation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. The idea that they might be in on the scam, trying to pass off a cheaper wine at an exclusive dinner, was a stain on their reputation far worse than a drop of red wine on a sleeve. Beatrice Croft's face, a mask of carefully constructed hauteur, finally crumbled. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The weapons she had always relied on, her husband's money, her own arrogance, were useless. Jean-Pierre Dubois, shaking off his paralysis, moved with a new and desperate energy. The manager who had been placating the Crofts was gone, replaced by a man fighting for the life of his restaurant. "Antoine," he commanded, his voice sharp, "take that bottle and every other bottle from that case to my office. Now. Leo, escort Mr. and Mrs. Croft to the lounge. Do not let them leave." He then turned to Eleanor, his face a mixture of awe and utter terror. "Miss Winter. Miss Vance. I am mortified. I have no words. I was wrong." "Yes, you were," Eleanor said, without malice. "You listened to the loudest voice, not the truest one. A common mistake, but a costly one." Her eyes found Maya, who was still standing by the table looking dazed. "And you owe this young woman the apology of your life." Dubois turned to Maya. His eye ferré. The silence that fell upon l'Étoile d'Or was not empty. It was a dense, heavy element, filled with the weight of shattered illusions. For a long moment, no one moved. The diners, once passive spectators, were now unwilling participants in a drama far more real than any they had paid for. They stared, not at the Crofts, but at the quiet, elderly woman in the simple grey dress, this unassuming titan who had just rearranged the very fabric of their reality. The name E.V. Winter echoed in the vacuum, a name synonymous with an almost terrifying integrity. Sterling Croft, his face a mottled patchwork of crimson and white, was the first to find motion, if not sense. He pushed his chair back with a violent scrape that tore through the quiet. "This is preposterous," he blustered, his voice lacking its earlier baritone of command. It was thin, reedy. "A fabrication. We're leaving." He reached for Beatrice's arm, a gesture meant to be commanding, but it looked like a drowning man grabbing for a float. "You will be staying." Eleanor's voice was not raised, yet it pinned him in place more effectively than a shout ever could. "Mr. Dubois has a matter of significant fraud to investigate, and your enthusiastic endorsement of the wine's perfection moments ago makes you a person of interest. One has to wonder, Mr. Croft, if you were merely a fool or a co-conspirator." The insinuation was a scalpel, expertly wielded. It sliced away the last of his bluster, exposing the panicked, hollow man beneath. A fool or a crook. In his world, there was no worse choice. Beatrice stared at Eleanor, her surgically tightened face a mask of disbelief. The world, as she understood it, had just been turned upside down. Power was wealth. Power was a Chanel blouse and a sharp tongue. It was not supposed to belong to a quiet old woman in the corner. Her entire belief system had been declared counterfeit, along with the wine. Jean-Pierre Dubois, galvanized by a terror that was existential, finally moved. The suave host vanished, replaced by a man fighting for the soul of his establishment. "Antoine!" he snapped, his voice a low, urgent command. "That bottle, the entire case from the cellar. My office. Now." He gestured to another waiter. "Leo, please escort Mr. and Mrs. Croft to the private lounge. See that they are comfortable, and that they remain there." The implication was clear. They were no longer guests. They were detainees. As the Crofts were led away, stripped of their audience and their arrogance, a strange thing happened. The room began to breathe again. A low murmur rippled through the diners, a sound of pure, unadulterated awe. They had not just seen a bully put in their place, they had witnessed a myth come to life. Dubois then turned to Eleanor, his face a wreck of conflicting emotions, terror, reverence, and a profound, gut-wrenching shame. "Miss Winter," he began, the name feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. "Miss Vance, there are no words. I was blind. I was a coward." "You were a businessman protecting an investment," Eleanor corrected him, not unkindly. "You listened to the customer with the biggest wallet, not the employee with the most integrity. It is a common and almost always fatal mistake in our industry." Her gaze shifted, finding Maya, who stood as if rooted to the spot, a silent pillar in the storm that had raged around her. "The person you truly owe an apology to is this young woman." Dubois faced Maya, and for the first time, he truly saw her. Not as a uniform, a pair of hands, a potential liability, but as a person. The professional mask was gone, and the man beneath was deeply, visibly ashamed. "Maya," he said, his voice thick, "there is no excuse for my behavior. I dismissed you. I failed to protect you. I put the vanity of those people above your dignity and your truth. I am profoundly sorry. What you did tonight, your courage, your knowledge, you represent the very standard I claim to uphold, while I represented the very worst of it. I beg your forgiveness." Maya looked at this man, who hours ago held her entire future in his hands, now humbled before her. She had wanted to be angry, to rage at the injustice, but seeing him so utterly broken, she felt a surprising and unwelcome pang of empathy. "I was just trying to do my job right," she whispered, the words feeling small and inadequate for the moment. "You did more than that," Eleanor said, her voice a warm current in the cold room. "You held on to the truth when it was the heaviest thing in the world to carry." She looked around the room, at the gawking faces, and offered a small, wry smile. "The evening's entertainment is concluded, ladies and gentlemen. I do hope you will enjoy the rest of your meals. The carrots, I can personally attest, are entirely authentic." A few hesitant chuckles broke the tension, then a wave of relieved laughter. The spell was broken. People turned back to their tables, the whispers now tinged with the thrill of having been present for a piece of history. In the stark, unforgiving light of Dubois' office, the final act of the fraud played out. The room smelled of old leather and new fear. Antoine, his hands trembling slightly, worked with the precision of a surgeon. He examined the cork from the bottle served to the Crofts. It was too firm, its pores too tight. "No vintage staining past the first few millimeters," he announced, his voice hushed. "This cork is less than 10 years old." He then placed the label under a loupe, the silence stretching as he studied it. "Pixelation," he breathed, looking up at Dubois, his eyes wide with horror. "Faint, but it's there. It's a digital print, a masterful one, but a print." Dubois sank into his chair, the air leaving his lungs in a ragged sigh. He stared at the row of fraudulent bottles on his desk, impostors in sacred vestments. 5 years? 5 years he had trusted his primary fine wine supplier. His mind reeled, calculating the potential scale of the deception, the financial ruin, the reputational apocalypse. He had built L'Etoile d'Or into a temple of authenticity, and now he discovered its very foundations were rotten. He had been so obsessed with the performance of luxury, with the starched uniforms and the hushed reverence, that he had failed to notice the lie at its very heart. The irony was a physical sickness in his gut. Maya stood by the door, watching. Dubois had insisted she be present as a witness to her own vindication. She watched the methodical deconstruction of the lie, and felt not triumph, but a strange, hollow sadness. This world she had so desperately wanted to join was just as flawed and fragile as any other. Meanwhile, in the velvet-lined prison of the private lounge, the Croft marriage was decomposing. The silence between them was corrosive. Beatrice stared at a modern art painting on the wall, not seeing it. Her mind was a maelstrom of humiliation. The whispers, the stares, the pity. She had built her identity on a scaffolding of public perception, and it had been demolished in a single sentence from a woman she wouldn't have glanced at twice on the street. "You should have just admitted you spilled it," she said, her voice a low, venomous hiss. Sterling, who had been nursing a glass of water, flinched. "Me? You're the one who started it. You could have let it go. It was a smudge. A smudge on a vintage Chanel blouse," she shrieked, whirling on him. "Something you know nothing about, just like you knew nothing about that wine. Perfection, you said. You sounded like a complete idiot. And you sounded like a shrill harpy demanding a girl get on her knees," he shot back, his face flushed. "Do you have any idea how we looked?" "How we looked?" Her laugh was brittle, ugly. "There is no we, Sterling. There is my father's money, and there is you, the buffoon I allow to spend it. And tonight, you failed spectacularly at the one thing you're supposed to be good at. Looking the part." The cruelty, once reserved for waitstaff and clerks, was now turned inward, their shared disgrace dissolving the last pretenses of their union. They were two fraudulent people, trapped in a room, with nothing left but the bitter taste of their own exposure. Eleanor found Maya in the staff locker room. The small, cluttered space felt more honest than the opulent dining room. Maya was slowly folding her apron, her movements precise, methodical, as if the simple task was the only thing tethering her to the ground. "I don't know what to say," Maya began, her voice barely a whisper. "You saved me." "My name is Eleanor," she said gently, closing the locker room door to give them a measure of privacy. "And you saved yourself, Maya. I only provided the platform. You had the knowledge. You had the courage to speak up, even when you were dismissed." That was the critical moment. Maya finally looked up, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. But he didn't listen. No one would have listened if you hadn't. "Perhaps," Eleanor conceded, "the world is not always fair. It often requires a person with power to amplify the voice of a person with truth. It's an unfortunate design." She paused, her gaze softening. "I read your application essay." Maya's brow furrowed in confusion. "My application?" "For the Culinary Institute of America's Winter Foundation Scholarship," Eleanor clarified, a small smile playing on her lips. "I am E.V. Winter, but the foundation is named for my husband, Arthur Winter. I read every single application myself. I remember yours vividly. You wrote about the terroir of memory, how the taste of a tomato from your grandmother's garden in Georgia contained the story of the soil, the sun, and her hands. You wrote that food wasn't about luxury, but about authenticity." The revelation landed with the force of a physical blow. Maya sank onto a small bench, her head in her hands. The anonymous benefactor, the legendary critic, the woman who had just defended her, they were all the same person. It was too much to comprehend. A single tear, hot and heavy, finally escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of shame or fear, but of a profound, overwhelming sense of being seen. "I knew you had a gift then," Eleanor continued, sitting beside her. "A palate that understands the story behind the taste. Tonight, you proved you also have integrity, which is a far rarer ingredient." The scholarship is yours, of course. Full funding. But I suspect that is only the beginning for you." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a simple, heavy cream card and a fountain pen. On it, she wrote a number. "Mr. Dubois will likely offer you a promotion, an apprenticeship. You should take it. Learn everything you can here. But when you graduate, when you are ready to build something of your own, I want you to call this number. My firm invests in talent, but more importantly, we invest in character. This industry is drowning in people who can mimic excellence. We need more people who can embody it." She pressed the card into Maya's hand. It felt impossibly heavy, a tangible piece of a future she had never dared to imagine. It was a key, a promise, a validation of her entire being. As Eleanor prepared to leave, Dubois met her by the main entrance. The restaurant was nearly empty now, the staff clearing tables with a funereal quiet. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice raw, "what happens now?" "Your column. A story about this. It will be the end of us." Eleanor pulled on her simple coat, looking at the man who had aged a decade in 3 hours. "What I'm going to write, Jean-Pierre, is a column about the anatomy of listening. I'm going to write about how the true strength of an establishment is not in its wine list, but in the character of its people. I will write about a brilliant young woman who, through her expertise and integrity, saved a venerable institution from a crisis of its own making." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "I am giving you a chance to make that story true. You have a cancer in your cellar and a flaw in your culture. How you choose to excise them will be the real test. Don't waste this." It was not forgiveness. It was a challenge, weighted with the full authority of her name. And it was an act of profound grace. She stepped out into the cool embrace of the city night. The air felt clean, sharp. She had come to this place to sit with the ghost of her husband, to feel close to him in a room he had loved. But the evening had become something else entirely. It had become a reaffirmation of the principles they had built their life on. Arthur had always despised bullies, but he despised the cowardice of bystanders even more. "Silence is a form of consent, Ellie," he used to say. Tonight she had not been silent. Walking down the glittering street, she felt his presence, not as a painful absence, but as a quiet, approving warmth beside her. Justice, she mused, was rarely a grand, sweeping affair. More often than not, it was a small, difficult thing. It was the decision to speak when it would be easier to stay quiet. It was the act of seeing the person everyone else was determined to overlook. It was the simple, unassailable power of a single, undeniable truth. And tonight, that had been more than enough.